again to the AI in healthcare education. Now we have two eminent people with us. We have seen the teaser. Professor Phaneendra Yalavarthy is going to take us through the types of clinical data and asking the right question. Right? He is a professor at ISC Bangalore. After his master's, he continued to do PhD in the biosciences and worked in the industry in Samsung and GE Healthcare as well. He's having 100 plus publications and a lot of patents. He's one of the pioneers in bridging the tech with medicine. And to moderate the session, we have Professor Anurag Agrawal, who is eminent personality. He worked in national institutes like IGAB, currently serving as Dean at Ashoka University in the bioside of it. Over to both of you. Over to Phaneendra sir.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Suresh. I would like to first of all thank NBE for giving me this opportunity. And I would also like to thank Anurag for being the moderator. So let's get started. So I have a disclaimer to start off to say that anybody who tells you that they are going to teach you about clinical data and asking the right questions for AI in about 45 minutes, I'll say that they are absolutely lying. There is no way I can do this in this 45 minutes given to me. So what I will try and do is that give a snippets of what is important and what is not important. And then hopefully this gives you some sense of how to handle the healthcare data. So to start off with, I will just say that I work with a lot of companies. So these are some disclaimers. But one thing I wanted to mention is that there is no competing financial interest that is there for this lecture. So as a broad overview, I would like to start off with AI revolution and what is the aspect of data to AI model, and then talk a little bit about AI lifecycle, and then come to the data aspects of healthcare, what is called as episodic versus continuum. And then I'm going to quickly go through creating your own data set, because I think a lot of you are interested in creating your own data set for AI models. So I'll just touch upon what is the overview of creating such a data set. And then I will leave you out with some challenges. I don't have any solutions for the data challenges, but I would like you to think about those challenges as well. So let me say that first of all, AI revolution is not only in the healthcare, it is happening across the globe, across the sectors. And currently the AI revolution which is happening is part of industry 4.0. That is after the third revolution which has started post 1970 about automated production, electronics, computers. So you generated a lot of digital data. And because of the digital data, you are also having this revolution around big data and AI. And, and if you really look at it, health sector up to 1990 went through a different phase of what I call it as more of prescriptive type care. From post 1990, health sector has progressed into what we call it as a little bit more into the wellness, prevention. So these have become very, very critical parts of it. So in a broad spectrum, health sector progress has been post 1990 has been phenomenal. The majority of the clinical practices have come and become a main board post 1990. And I just want to point out the difference between traditional programming and AI. This is a very important one from the data aspect. So for example, let's imagine that you have a program where you want to know if I give a temperature, whether it will tell, whether it is a fever, positive or not. So for example, assume that the temperature is 102 degrees Fahrenheit. That 102 degree Fahrenheit you give is what we call it as the input. And the program has a simple, what we call it as a matching one. If it is greater than 100 degree Fahrenheit, then we want to say output is fever positive. So in this case, you are giving an input, and then there is a code that exists in the computer which checks 100 degree Fahrenheit above or below. If it is above, then it will say it is fever positive. In the AI world, what we want to do is that we want to give input and output. So in this case, we wanted to give inputs like 102, and then we want to give what is called as output or the label which says fever positive. So that means that we give the data, which is input output data pairs, to a computer, and we would like it to come up with that rule or come up with that program. So the program has to say that, okay, anything above 100 is actually fever positive, anything below 100 is fever negative. So for that, AI, so the fundamental aspect of AI is all about data. So let me show you a little bit more as we go along, you'll understand this. But at least if you look at the advancement of AI, the first part, there are three things we say that which has advanced the AI. One is the data, another is algorithms, and third one is compute. Fundamentally, data is what has been the foundation for the AI advancement. So you have this digitalization, you have new sources of data. For example, 10 years back, there is no variable state. Today, almost, I know it is estimated that 40% of the population are using some kind of variables. So now you have these new algorithms like deep learning algorithms, foundational models like ChatGPT. You have good optimizations which have come up. And then you also have computing, which has become the mainstream. For example, the most valuable company in the world is NVIDIA, which is making all these GPUs, which are used for the AI development. So in some sense, all these three have contributed, but the foundation of AI has always been on the data. That's why it is a very, very important task. Let me start off with a little more nuanced application. I work in medical imaging. So a lot of my applications are going to revolve around medical imaging. So let's say that you want to train a model which will look at chest x-rays and then say whether it is pneumonia positive or negative. So that means that you need to have two things. One is the chest x-ray, and then we call it as corresponding labels for it. So the bluish ones are the ones which we call it as labels, which are telling you pneumonia positive or negative. So we give these two to the training part of the AI algorithm, and it will give us what is called as a model. So, and then when we get a new chest x-ray, which is not part of any of the training data, we give it to this trained model and then ask it to predict or infer whether it is pneumonia positive or not. So that means that AI model has two phases. One is the training phase. Another one is, you can call it as inferencing phase, testing phase, or prediction phase, where you give the model an unseen data and then ask it to predict what will be the outcome. In this case, pneumonia positive or not. So most of the metrics which you see for the AI algorithms are these at the inference stage, are what we call it as prediction phase. So the problem is that the data which you have given to train the model is what is typically called as a data set. And because of that, what happens is that whatever data you have, if it has a bias, then what you are going to get is a biased AI prediction. For example, let's imagine in this case where you said that all the data I have for the chest x-rays are above the age of 75 years. So then any prediction you do below 75 years, you don't have any representation of such data. So that might be a biased AI, right? So now there might be other data cleaning you have done. For example, the chest x-rays, somehow you removed all the ribs or you suppressed all the ribs. So that means that you have done a biased data cleaning. So anything which is present with ribs are suppressed, we call this as a domain shift. And then our, in the labeling itself, what is the label? We said that pneumonia positive or negative. You got a clinician or a labeler who is having only very limited experience. So then your labels also might be not accurate. So in any of these cases, you have this biased AI outcomes. And in fact, there are a lot of biases. I'm not going into all these biases. But traditionally, this bias shows up most of the time when we are trying to do the inference. So you may not know the bias while training, but during the inference, you get this bias. For example, here the bias has been towards what we call it as towards the race. So if you see here, the white patients which are actually requiring the need versus predicted care, it was able to somehow match it. But when it came to the population which are black, which was not represented in the training data, it was predicting that they don't require that much care, but actual requirement was much higher. So this is just to show these examples. So now whenever we talk about AI solutions, you also have to think about AI solutions are across the healthcare continuum. So they are not only in the clinical diagnosis, they are in the drug discovery, they are in the administrative operations, they are in the patient care, they are in the emergency medicine, they are there in the preventive health. So that means that now you can think about for each of these and the healthcare continuum, you also require continuum data. But all you want to develop a continuum application, then you require continuum data as well. So this will become a little more clearer when I talk about episodic versus continuum. And one of the point I wanted to mention is that this is for all of you who are doctors. So this is a study which was done in the US. So between 23 and 24, in 23, 1 in 3 doctors have used AI to a certain extent. That is what we call as AI adoption rate is. But 24, it has become 2 in 3. So what is expected is that in the next 5 years, 90% of the doctors will use somewhat AI. So it's also important for us, and thanks to NBE, which is able to put up a program for you to bring that awareness. What are the limitations of AI? In some sense, in this session, we are talking about what are the limitations with the data. Again, I also want to focus that saying that there is something called as key focus areas for each of the regions. For example, North America, which is mostly US, has almost more than 50% share. They focus on medical imaging and diagnostic tools, which is AI is catering to. Whereas we are all part of Asia Pacific, most of our AI has been towards mobile health apps and telemedicine. So depending on the demographic area, your AI utility might change, but overall the adoption rates are going up. That's a point I wanted to point out. So this is the AI life cycle. In fact, this is, if you ask me what is the most important slide for this lecture, I will say that this is it. So first of all, if you want to develop AI, or if you want to use AI in the clinic, the first important thing for us is to identify the need. So whether you have a need for it, remember that AI is not needed everywhere. For example, let's take this example of chest X-ray where we are telling whether it is pneumonia positive or negative. So you identify the need saying that currently that report or report generation on chest X-ray is taking 1 hour. And your need is to bring it down to half an hour. That means that you want the AI to generate that report within half an hour or AI assisted report to come out within half an hour. So then you describe what is the existing workflow, what happens after the chest X-ray is acquired. So does they go into the PAC system? Does the radiologist read? So now you describe that, and then you say what is the desired target state. I already told you the desired target state need not be about accuracy, need not be about what is the positive predictive value or negative predictive value. It could be just simply saying that I want the report generation to go down from 1 hour to 30 minutes. And then you develop this AI system or acquire an AI system, and then you implement that in the target setting. When you say implement, you integrate to what is existing workflow, and you monitor the performance. When we say monitor the performance, what do we mean is we already know what is the target we are looking for. So that means that this is what we were calling earlier as a testing phase of it. So our inference phase of it. So you do that ongoing performance. For example, you have reached the desired target. You have reduced the report generation of chest X-ray from 1 hour to half an hour. Then you make it. Or you have gone from 1 hour to something, let's imagine 45 minutes. So then you might need to go back and update the model, right? Or update the need. So, or maybe update what is your target status. 45 minutes is better than 60 minutes. So you might have to do all this, what is called as update of what is your metric is, or update the current workflow, or maybe update the need. Or in some cases, let's say that implementing AI has gone from 1 hour to, let's imagine 2 hours it is taking because of implementation of AI. So then we de-implement it. We say that no, we cannot implement the AI in the target setting. We de-implement because earlier it was taking 1 hour. So remember that each one of this is actually linked to the data. So when you have a need, if you want to develop AI system, you require input output pairs. If you want to know the performance, again, you require some test data to be there. So how do you know which is the performance? You need to know what is the existing time versus current timing in this case. So in some sense, the whole AI life cycle, at least in the healthcare, revolves around the data, right? So that means that unless you have this data, you cannot do any of this management. So let me give you a simple examples. I mean, these are not my examples. So these are a little bit older, but this also makes sense. So this is way back in 2019. This was published in Nature, where they looked at all the electronic health records data of the pediatric patients, and they looked at about 1.3 million EHRs of the pediatric patients. They extracted what is called a symptom, signs, and history. They also have corresponding diagnosis for it. So this is called as data points. They extracted about 101 million points. And then they trained an AI algorithm. This is called as a natural language processing model. That means that from the HRs, they made it into what we call a structured database, where you have symptoms on one side and you have the corresponding diagnosis on the other side. And gave that data such that when the new data came with symptoms, could we assess the what is the diseases. So in fact, I'm not going into this, but one thing which I wanted to point out was, so compared to what is the ground truth was, the ground truth was done by what is called as experienced physicians groups. So that is physician group 3, 4, and 5. They all got around 90% accuracy, whereas the physician group 1 and 2 have got only the 83% accuracy, which is lesser than the AI model. AI model accuracy was 88%. So that means that this also showed that maybe the junior physician required this AI model. The senior physicians may not require the AI model itself. That is also one of the things which you should understand, that AI is not meant for everybody. So there should be also what is experience level which is required for it. We call it as intended use as well. So the other one is, again, this is way back in 2010, where they looked at the breast cancer screening using mammograms. And breast cancer is one of the common form of cancer among the women. 1 in 9 get affected. They just want to distinguish between malignant and benign. So again, just to those of you who know mammograms, and there is something called as BIRAD score. So the 1, 2, 3 is considered as benign, 4, 5, 6 is what is considered as a malignant one. So they just wanted to do a binary classification. Given a mammogram, can we say whether it is benign or malignant? So in a very, very simple sense, so in this case, early detection is the key for us. So they looked at 60,000 mammograms and they have corresponding BIRAD score which tell that whether it is benign or malignant. They trained the artificial neural network, and then once it has neural network has given 96% accuracy, whereas a regular radiologist have an accuracy around 94%. So more or less comparable, but this is being driven by machine, which is AI model is nothing but a computer model which you have generated. So this doesn't get tired, you can do more and more readings, whereas typical radiologist might get tired. So that was a whole concept. So if at all you ask me, what are the current challenges for the AI in the healthcare is? So there are mainly, I'm going to talk about only in the data part, but there are other challenges in terms of models and results. I will ask the question is that, for example, for every AI model development, you require data. So first question to ask is that how many patients data we need for an AI algorithm? For example, the examples we have seen in the pediatric patient cases, they had 1 million patients. In the mammographic data, they had 60,000 mammograms. So how do you determine how much data do we need? And again, I don't have a solution for it. It's a big research problem. There are people who work their lifetime to answer this question. So now let's assume that you said that, like, if you are like me working in medical imaging, you say that, okay, somehow for the chest X-ray problem, I require 60,000 cases or 60,000 chest X-rays. Now, what happens if you don't have 60,000? What happens if you are working on diagnosis of one of the rarest diseases? So what do you do? Then, okay, you have the images, but you don't have corresponding annotations. Remember, the annotations has to come from what we are calling it as the experts. So what happens if there are not that many experts available in that particular disease or in that particular spectrum? So again, there are no easy answers to be given here. Each one of them is a big question. How do you determine how much data do we need? I would argue saying that we keep adding more and more data, and we keep seeing whether there is an improvement in the model accuracy. If the model accuracy is getting plateaued, that means that we have enough representation. And what happens if you don't have enough data? You do a good data augmentation. You try to generate somewhat like a synthetic data for using the existing data. What happens if you don't have enough annotation? There is something called a semi-supervised and unsupervised models, which you can develop. Again, each one of them is a big area. Let's not get into it, but I just wanted to point out that these three are the biggest questions in terms of the clinical data and in terms of model development as well. So now let's switch back and then look at it. What are the data we have right now? And healthcare is a slightly complex one. So when I say complex one, even in the India also this is increasing trend. You have 3 Ps which are part of the healthcare. So one is a patient who is actually the one whose data we are all collecting. And then you have the provider. When I say provider, these are like clinics which are really maintaining the what we call it as the electronic medical record or electronic health record or the clinical notes. And then you have a payer, which is like an insurance agency, which is doing the claim processing. So in some sense, even though the patient is the one which is getting a service from the provider, right? But the payment might come from a third party, which is like a payer. It could be insurance agency, it could be like Ayushman Bharat scheme. And then you also have other stakeholders which are part of the healthcare. Like, for example, think about like pharma companies which are producing drugs. Think about like medical device companies which are making the devices. They also sit on a lot of data, right? So now you can think about that, we have a lot of data which is sitting in with each one of them. And they are all part of the healthcare continuum, right? So for example, patients might be having all these wearables data. All the electronic health records are with the providers. And the payers are having all the financial data. The stakeholders have all what is called as clinical trials or randomized clinical trial data, which might give you adverse reactions data and other things, which are all very important as well. So ideally, we want to use all this data to potentially benefit everybody in the healthcare, right? So in a very, very nutshell, the famous statement for the AI in the healthcare is, could I provide the right intervention to the right patient at the right time? So that means that we want that to be fully data driven, and we want to provide the right intervention to the right patient at the right time. Of course, this is the biggest North Star we have. I mean, in the sense that that is our ultimate aim. We may not reach there, or we might take another 30 years to reach there. But that's the question we are interested in answering. So, and again, if I look at all the data, so in some sense, what is estimated is that if you have a 500-bedded hospital, the hospital alone generates about 1 petabyte of data per day. So, and 90% of that healthcare data, which is by volume, is all images. And these images tend to be what we call a structured format. So that's why anything data-driven intervention, it is going to come in the imaging world first and go to the other areas. So that means that if at all you are looking at AI developments or AI tools which are exist in healthcare, a lot of them are related to radiology. In fact, 75% of them are related to radiology. That is because by volume, that much data is what we have. So again, I wanted to point out this and then say that if at all you want to think philosophically about the data point, I will argue saying that philosophically the data point needs to have something we call it as a symbolization. So for example, the data itself which is existing right now symbolizes certain people, events, things, and ideas. For example, I can call name as the data. So now the name represents a person, right? So now, or if I have a chest X-ray, that is also symbolizing the person, right? So what typically humans do is that humans really don't use the data. I mean, in the sense that what humans use is what we call it as information. And what computers use is data. So in a very, very nutshell, if as a human, what you do is that we try to make it convertible into information, or we convert into information as long as we understand. So that means that when you introduce the data in a format that is easy for humans to understand, you make data into information. So now what is that format which is required for computers or machines that has been the biggest black box for us? How does the machines are able to get to that information is what is the biggest. So whereas even for humans, how do you convert data into information has also been a what I call it as still unsolved problem for us. So again, in a nutshell, when we do a lot of these things, what happens is that one person data becomes another person's information, right? So that means that the human which is there, at least in the healthcare, has learned from past data and then using it. For example, in the case of what we were talking about, beyond 100 degrees is fever positive. So that has been a traditional knowledge which has been passed on, which has been observed on particular patients and have become information. So, and healthcare also does the data in two different settings. We call it as episodic part of it and continuum part of it. So episodic means that you are treating a specific condition at a specified time. That means that for that instance, you have the data. Continuum means that can you have over the time. So you can think about like having all the data starting from the immunization, which is happening post-birth, all the way till now, the human exists. Can I collect all the data which has been done? When I say all the data, remember that we have the patient data, we have the provider data, we have the payer data. So could we collect all that and put them into continuum? So we call it as conveyor belt. Can you have the conveyor belt type of data? So because unless you have that data, you may not be able to answer questions which are come up in the continuum, right? I will talk about the questions in a while. But let me go back to the data. So this is again going back to a little bit more of data science than the healthcare world. But let me just put that data is typically we call it as there are three types of data. First one we call it as unstructured data. The other one we call it as semi-structured data. The third one is structured data. In a very simple sense, structured data, as the name represents, is an organized form of data. It has rows and columns. We call it as there is a relationship that exists. And then the computer program can easily understand. So those of you who work in image, DICOM image is a very structured data format. You have imaging data and you have a header for the DICOM which tells you who is the patient, what is the age of the patient, what scanner was used, what kind of protocol was followed, what is the resolution of this, and what is the pixel spacing. So it gives you all kinds of that metadata. So that makes it a very structured. So that's why I already mentioned that most of the AI development has been towards imaging, at least in the healthcare world, because of the structured one. We want that structured data. So now there is so if you have slightly disorganization of the data, you have something called a semi-structured. It kind of conforms to a data model, but doesn't have a very good structure. The best example is your health records. You have a EHR platform where I can type in some things. That is a free form text, right? So now that we call it as that is belonging to the patient, but then it is not really doesn't have the metadata on what context that EHR was written, right? So for example, did the patient walked in with a leg pain, but then you wrote saying that the leg is swollen. So what has been the chief complaint if you have not captured? So then we call it a semi-structured. You don't have all the information you need. Unstructured is like, for example, you go to Google or you go to any other search engine and you search for a literature about a disease, then that is what we call it as unstructured. And in fact, healthcare world, at best, we can expect that healthcare world has semi-structured data. Not all the data which is collected either by the patient or the provider or the payer is actually structured data. Now this brings us to a fine concept. A lot of the times it is missed. So of course we interchangeably use these health records as per our convenience. But I just wanted to point out that there are three different aspects of health records. The first one is the EMR, electronic medical record. So electronic medical record typically gets curated by a particular department in a particular provider facility. So that means that if you have a cardiology department has one EMR. If you have a neurology department, it has another EMR for the same patient. But when we aggregate all the EMRs, which is coming from different departments, then we call that as EHR, which is electronic health record. So in some sense, electronic health record is a combination of all the EMRs. And then you have this PHR, which is aggregated by the patient, we call it as. For example, somebody is having a wearable weight, or somebody is having a CGM, so continuous glucose monitor. And that data we call it as is coming in the PHR. Ideally, all the data belongs to the patient, but the part which the patient accumulates, we call it as less regulated. And whereas the HR and the EMR is highly regulated, right? So in a very simple sense, if you look at it from the quality point of view, EMR and EHR gets collected in a controlled environment. And then there is also quality check, or it is administered in such a way that the quality is maintained. Whereas the PHR is what patient is accumulating, or the part which is outside the EHR. So you cannot guarantee the quality around it. That's the point I wanted to make it here. And also the privacy rules doesn't apply the same way. This becomes and shows up in multiple instances. So now before all these things, what we are calling it as data sets, earlier we were collecting it as patient registries. Those who come from registries background, I will say that you are not really that behind. All the AI data sets today are nothing but patient registries, right? Of course, you have emerging data type that is coming up, like, a lot of it has become digital. A lot of it also has become, now you're collecting like, genetic data, things like that. Again, what I want to point out is that remember that data quality is what is one of the important metric for us. I told you already about the bias which is there, that you see biased model. Lot of the data quality also is about the question we are trying to answer. So for example, let's imagine that I have the patient's data. I just want to answer the question saying that what will be the expected OPD count tomorrow for a particular hospital. So here you are not interested in whether you have done the correct diagnosis or not, whether patients have left with satisfaction or not. You are just interested in knowing how many patients will visit tomorrow in the OPD. Right. So now here data quality is metric is as long as you are able to capture all the patients walking in. And if you have that count right, you have the quality. But then you ask the question saying that all the people who have walked into OPD were correctly diagnosed. Or you ask the question saying that are all of them needed to come for OPD, right? So now your quality metric has changed now. Now that means that you are talking about now diagnostic accuracy, or what is the patient condition is, whether it has been correctly diagnosed. Now that means that I need to have a ground truth. What is the ground truth for it? And that means that you need to have multiple checks of the patient. So did we do it? So traditionally, all the clinical data that exists has been very, very episodic. Typically, people have walked into the provider facilities if they had a complaint. And then once their complaint has been addressed, they walked away from the what we call it as the provider facility. Whereas today, what we are talking about is all this big data, where you want to accumulate this data over the continuum of the life cycle of the person and the life of the person, such that you can really do this. So that means that the criteria for the quality also has shifted. When I say continuum, you might want to combine the CGM data, which I am collecting as a person, compared to all the capillary blood glucose level tests which were done at a hospital facility or a diagnostic center. So that is what makes it as continuum, right? So that means that I cannot guarantee on the continuum the data quality. So that's a point I want to mention there. So, and also the big data has these 4 issues: volume, velocity, variety, and veracity. So veracity is one of the important characters of big data. When you talk about big data, you also expect that there are a lot of errors. So when I say a lot of errors, what is the typical percentage of errors we talk about is anywhere between 20 to 30% errors is very, very common in the big data world, right? And of course, what you are trying to bring with all this data is, I told you that the metric we want to do is that can we do right intervention for the right person at the right time. So that means that you are trying to bring a value for this data. And remember, big data as such in the 4 V's, there is no value associated with it. So now again, I already mentioned this. I'm just going to skip. So if at all I think about the big data, you have all these types of data, right? So you have pharmacy claims, you have government health plans, right? Like Ayushman Bharat is a good example there. You have private players. Almost 60 to 70% of the current healthcare in India is all done by private players. And you have these patient registries. Now you are doing genomics, and you have this hospital EHRs, and you have this non-retail outlet which are doing purely a diagnostic tests. And you have this mobile data or variables like CGM is a good example there. You also have a lot of the claims which has gone to the insurance agency. So these are all part of the big data, right? So now out of which you want to make some sense and get it out into this. So again, this is just to say that there is variety of data that exists. And then how do we really take that and convert into what we call as usability? So I want to give a few examples of what has been, right? So remember, we talked about the pediatric condition. So what we have done is that we have taken the EHR data, we wrote down all the symptoms, we also wrote corresponding diseases. So this we call it a structured EHR. You made somehow unstructured into structured, right? Now, most of the clinical notes that exist in EHR are all unstructured. Or even if it is unstructured, can you make some sense out of it? For example, if you think about ChatGPT, ChatGPT has been trained on the data which exists on the internet. And I already told you the data which exists on the internet is all unstructured. But it has learned from, or it has had some sense out of it. So could we also do that? And medical imaging data, I already told you, right? In the chest X-ray example, we have this. You have claims data, you have variable data, you have physician dictation data. So how do we really put that into training and come up with models? It all depends on what is the need for us and what is the existing workflow for us, and then how do we put a target state around it, right? So not every data can be used for the end. At the same time, just because you have a particular episode data, you may not be able to answer the continuum. For example, you have one instance of the blood glucose level. Can you determine, like, what will be the complications of the diabetes? Right. So that is not possible with one instance of the diabetes data, right? Or one instance of the blood glucose level. You require continuum data for it. So that's the part I wanted to emphasize. So I'm going to skip this part, but I just wanted to point out that anytime we have the data, the quality becomes very, very important. So if you have data which is very much like a garbage, so when you put a garbage into the model is learning from the data, you get only the garbage, right? In the healthcare world, you put garbage in, you might get a gospel out, right? Remember that we are all trying to do the diagnosis, or we are trying to do the right intervention for the patient. So in some sense, that becomes a big shift. The quality is the most important. So do you have that metrics for the quality? How do you define the quality is also depends on the question you are trying to answer. In the OPD case, I told you about, if you are interested in just determining how many people are going to visit tomorrow a particular hospital for the OPD, that quality metric is different than how many people who are correctly diagnosed. Right? So in some sense, you want to have that quality of data metric very clearly defined. You want to standardize the entry. You want to describe or design the data elements to avoid errors. So that means that you want to have well-designed interfaces. And then you also want to document what is your inclusion criteria, what is your exclusion criteria. And you want to build the human capacity around it. So in some sense, quality is not really a biggest strength of what we call as healthcare data is. Because a lot of you who are doctors are very well trained to work with imperfect data. But AI model is not like that, because what you have is information. But the AI development is all about data, because the computer consumes the data. So if your data doesn't have the quality, so then the model you are going to get, the AI model you are going to get will be always be biased, or it will be a garbage. And in fact, I can tell you, I've been working in the model development for more than now 15 years. I can invariably tell you that 90% of our AI development we do is about this data quality. Right? So that means that we do a lot of cleanup of our data. And in fact, even after that, what we get is that 70% of our AI algorithms are only locally accurate. So that means that if I collect the data from one particular site and then take that algorithm and then try to test it on another site, because there is a lot of shift in the quality metrics and the protocols, we get at least, I will argue saying that 20 to 30% less accuracy. So that has been a fundamental problem. This is all revolved around the data part. So again, how do you become good with the data? I will argue saying that there is no shortcut for this. Everybody has to learn from the experience. So you have to come up with those metrics. You have to practice it. There is no shortcut in this. So you learn with the exercise. So again, I just wanted to point out that there is a concept called as bias and variance. So you might have, if it is a biased data, you can correct it. If it has large variability, there is no way you can correct that data. You cannot apply any corrective measures for the variance other than going back and making sure that the data you are collecting doesn't have that much variance. So that means that I told you about the upfront thing which you have to do, train the people so that you can get a good quality data, right? So if it is a biological variance, then you also want to be aware of that. So if the biological, if your test itself is having 5% accuracy, you cannot expect the data you are having an accuracy of less than 5%. Right? So that's a very simple way of understanding it. So typically, if it is a numerical data, what we try to do is that we try to plot it. So we try to plot it that, we call it as, 25 percentile to 75 percentile. So that you can call it as 1 sigma to 2 sigma. And if you plot it, it should nicely follow a Gaussian curve. And anything which we call it as tiles, so which is this part, which is the end of this Gaussian curve, that should not be exceeding 3%. So that means that totally 6% is what you can expect out of the 1 sigma or 2 sigma. Anything which is going to the tiles, which is more than 6% of your data, which you have collected, or at least 10% of the data, then you got to go back and check your quality metrics. That is what we try to do if it is a numerical data. So I have come to almost to an end, but I just wanted to point out that if you at all you want to create your own data set, one of the important point I wanted to mention is that whatever medical data which is there is never AI data. So you should start with, you have a retrospective or a prospective data you want to do. First part is get the ethical board approval. Every hospital today has ethical board. You get access to the data, you query the data what you need, you do something called as de-identification. And then you get the data in our de-identified data into your system. You do a little bit of quality check. I already spoke about quality, and you make it into a structured format. Remember, in the pediatric cases, they had EHRs, but they listed all the symptoms and all the diseases. And then you put the labels for it, and then that is what gets into the model development. So the only point, and there is a nice paper which was written around it, I will say must read for all of you. The only thing I want to point out is that there are new methodologies for this de-identification. In the healthcare world, you don't really anonymize the data, you de-identify so that you can re-identify the patient if it is required. So there is something called a safe harbor and expert determination. If it is a multimodal data which you are having, safe harbor is typically applied on like medical images, which is very structured. And expert is the one which you typically apply if you have multimodal. Multimodal means that you have text data, you have waveforms, you have this. So that means that you do it, for example, Safe Harbor has nicely these identifiers. So you can use these, write a simple program to remove all this identifier from that one. So again, I just wanted to point out and then stop it there with some challenges here. So for example, here is the case where I was involved in the study where we were asking the experts to mark the lung nodules. So now each one of the color you see here, whether it is blue, green, or violet, these are all done by different experts. So now obviously none of them are matching, right? So this is a fundamental thing, right? So now which one will you take it as a ground for your training the model? Will you take an average? Will you take who is more experienced? Or you can ask fundamentally different question and say that are these variations really clinically significant? Do they change anything to do with the diagnosis? So those questions we are, are still unsolved. But in some sense, I wanted to think about these which are there. So I'm going to leave with some challenges. So I already mentioned this, saying that existing medical data is never AI ready. You don't have input-output pairs. You have a chest X-ray, then you have some report. Right? The report doesn't clearly mention whether it is pneumonia positive or negative. They write saying that not positive for pneumonia. Right? If you search for positive pneumonia, then you are going to get all these cases which are also not positive for pneumonia. So in some sense, you want to do a little bit of cleanup for it and prepare the data for the AIs. And then a lot of the healthcare data that exist in our systems are largely episodic. They're all fragmented, right? So you don't have a continuum data like anywhere else. Of course, Ayushman Bharat digital mission and all trying to get into this federated part of it. And we also have errors in terms of data entries. So what we are entering into any of these EHRs, EMRs, there is large number of errors. It is well known that 30% of our that entry errors are more than 30%. And you also have issues around data quality, a lot of missing fields and other things. And what is the ground truth we take? What is the ground truth we wish to take, right? Is it consensus among the clinician? There is a lot of biological variability. I just now showed you a case of lung nodule marking. But which one do you take as a ground truth? So I just wanted to leave with a question, right? So if you have a single chest X-ray of a patient, what is the right question to answer? So can you answer the question that can AI predict what is the likelihood of this patient developing lung cancer? Just having only that data. Or do you require more data? For example, if you want to know whether they have been smokers or non-smokers. Or can you ask the question, can AI predict whether this patient is pneumonia positive? Will that mark, will that information exist in that data? And remember, we are processing the information, whereas the computer is processing the data. So in this question, the right question is the pneumonia positive or not, because that is what is the data which is represented. Right? So in some sense, we also want to answer this question. So this is where I'm going to stop. There are new challenges that are coming in. For example, DPTP Act was passed in November of 2025, which is about 3 months back. So you have new privacy law. You have new multimodals. You have data harmonization issues. You are, for example, COVID-19 was not existing until 2019. Now you have COVID-19 as a new subclass of COVID. And you also have this continuous data which new and new variables are giving in. CGM was non-existent 10 years back. Today it is existing. So what you do, there are more and more data getting here. So that is where I'm going to stop. Thank you for patiently listening to me. Over to Phaneendra.
Thank you very much, Phani. That was a wonderful introduction to the doctors on not only just the data, but the right type of questions to ask. As you can expect, many of the questions were around data itself, and many were about how to use AI, the importance of building AI. The first question I think that we should probably discuss is when you say annotation of data. As a computer scientist, annotation of the medical data, what is it that you need? And number two, is it really important to have Indian data to make sure that AI solutions for doctors in India actually work? Let's take these two questions first.
Okay, so I can answer the first question. In my view, this is purely my view. To me, data doesn't have any value. So what you require is data with expertise. Right? Remember that as humans, we process information. So I need that data plus information. So I want to know the process of how a clinician has taken the data and converted that into information. Right? So this is a very, very important concept, right? So I call data as being the foundation. So, but nobody is going to give you any money if you have only foundation. You cannot rent it up. What you build on top of it is what is usable or what makes revenue out of it. Same way, data is that foundation we require. Without that, we cannot start. But we also require that expertise with that. And whenever we ask the annotation to be done, typically the way we follow it is we somehow get at least 2 people to look at the data and do the annotation. And then we try to bring some consensus among them, even though it is very hard to bring the same consensus among the clinicians. But we try to take somewhat a middle path of the average of both. And if it is an annotation on like this lung nodule case, we try to take an average part of it. So if there is no consensus, we go with the most experienced clinician. So we take that as a ground reference. Okay. So now the second question to answer is what you have asked is a very, very important question. So let me just give you a counter example. So today, Delhi, I think currently the air quality index is about 500. Correct? So if somebody is coming up with a cough, you know that it is because of bad air quality. Right? So we cannot put the same condition which is on the Western data. So for example, Singapore air quality is 75. So if model has been tried on cough analysis, right, to determine, let's say, TB. Now this is 2 different things, right? So we have a lot of environmental factors, lot of personalized factors which come into it. In some sense, if you don't have Indianized data or Indian data set, I already told you that almost all the AI algorithms are locally accurate. So when you bring it to another site, another place, their accuracy falls down by 22%. So in a very simple sense, if we don't have Indian data, we cannot really use AI for our settings.
Thanks, Vani. And I think the very important, clear derivation from that is that expert Indian doctors annotating high quality Indian data and making it available to researchers in India is pretty much the only way forward for high quality AI solutions to be built. Now, on the same line, now we're talking about AI solutions and how well they work, how they do not work. How do you measure how well an AI solution works? How do we deal with errors? Who takes responsibility? Any thoughts on that from your side?
So the data quality metric is largely varying based on the question you ask. So there is a new concept called as trust metric. So we call it as a trust metric. For example, let me explain in non-medical terms. So Anurag, this is up to Anurag and Dr. Suresh as well. If I ask you to give a 1 rupee, you are not going to think so much and give me that 1 rupee. But let's say that I ask you to give me 1 lakh. And then you have to think about whether you trust me or not with that 1 lakh or not. Similarly, healthcare also, when the stakes are very high. If you have to do a cardiac surgery, your stake is much higher, right? Whereas if you are only just determining that how many people are going to walk into your OPD. So that's a different metric altogether. So in a very, very simple sense, the quality we talk about or the thing we talk about is depends on the trust we have. And that trust of the AI model comes from the trust in the data also. Right? So that means that if the stakes are high, we have to have higher bar for it. If the stakes are low, we can have a lower bar. And remember, also, this is a very, very important thing because somehow in our fancy world, we think that AI is about self-driving cars. I mean, this is what we say, right? And if you look at any self-driving car video, they all show you on a nice sunny day, very clear highway. It is not jam-packed traffic like Bangalore traffic, and it is not raining at all. And that is what self-driving is happening. So that means that your benchmark for AI to work has been compared to an average condition, average drive. Whereas in the healthcare world, our benchmark is that all of you get trained for at least for 10 years before we can do it, right? So in some sense, we are telling that we have to compare with like a race car driver. Our AI should work on par with the race car driver. But is there any race car driver which AI is competing with? So the bar is very high, at least in the clinical world, because medicine is always evidence-based. And the evidence we are trying to build are what we are posing against is most experienced clinicians.
So 2 further questions along this line. One is that, to extract large amounts of data and check the quality. For example, we can take the example of electronic health records to extract a large amount of data from both structured and unstructured data contained within it. We will often have to use other AI. And that's something, for example, we have all seen LLMs being used now to pass through electronic health records and recreate a more organized structured data for use. So use of AI to generate data for AI and to check quality for AI training gets circular at some point. How do you see this going forward?
So technically, anybody who's using LLM to extract the data from EHR, I would say please be careful because any data you are putting into the LLM is also using that data for its own training purposes. So in some sense, you are violating the patient privacy part by uploading the data into the LLM because there is no on-the-prem LLMs that we are aware of. Or at least if you are using it, please download locally the model and then use it. For example, MedGemma is a good example where we have a local model which can be downloadable and used. So that's the first part I wanted to mention. So in this space of what we call it as a circular data, where LLM is extracting some data and we are using that data for training, building an AI model. There are 2 AI models. One is which is giving the input to the other AI model, right? So in this process, one of the quality checks we do is that we at least leave out some data. So that means that we don't use, for example, even on the prem, you are using some data extraction tools. We say that can we do manually this data extraction and compare the performance of the data we extracted versus what AI model is extracting. Of course, to compare it, you need to have some metrics around it, right? So you need to clearly define those metrics. For example, if it's images and you are extracting like this lung nodules, we have some metrics like signal to noise ratio. You have metrics around what we call it as calibration errors. So you have to clearly define those metrics and compare them. That means that you always want to think about what is the human alternative. And at least some part of the data, 5 to 10% of the data, you try to do it with a human alternative and compare, such that you don't have any hallucinations, you don't have anything that is getting created. And in fact, those of you who doesn't know, there is something called a zeros GPT. So the zeros GPT will also, if you put a paper in, it will also tell you whether the, for example, like, the reference is hallucinated reference or which is actual reference which exists in the PubMed. So
I think
in
on the
some sense, you
same
also
line,
want to come up with these kind of tools or metrics for it. But the primary goal is there a human alternative? And if it exists, please use it.
I think on the same lines, continuing forward, if a critical part of doing this is evaluating the errors, then it automatically stands to reason that people with domain expertise must be part of this type of data extraction, structuring, organization, things like this. And the presence of people with their inputs regarding what data might be more valuable, where the corruption is coming, and their discussions with data science members of the team is probably very important to create high quality products. Your thoughts?
Absolutely. I already mentioned this, that in my view, data has zero value. So what has value is data plus that expertise which the domain experts bring, right? Because only the domain expert can understand the context, right? Whereas data scientists like us, we don't understand the context very well. And almost healthcare in a nutshell works in the context, right? Most of the data science works out of the context. So that means that if at all you are doing data extraction and you want to define clearly the quality metrics, for example, I showed you whether the quality metric is clinically significant or not. That's a very important question. Now, who will determine the clinical significance? That is only the domain experts can determine. So in my view, it has to be a synergy between all of them. If you are not involving the clinical experts or the domain experts into your data extraction process or data set creation process, I will say that your model, whether you want to believe it or not, is going to be a biased model. And is going to end up with what we call it as erroneous results, like garbage in, gospel out.
Now, I think on that note, context, let me move to the broader questions on AI in general. One of them, of course, is that medical AI or some products that are free are already being used by patients and doctors. Do you think that's a dangerous trend of products that have never been actually approved, never been examined, directly being used by doctors and patients? And if so, what do you see as the biggest danger there?
So see, I want to tell what is the regulatory says, and I'll come and answer this question. Currently, the regulator says that AI is like a calculator. For example, you as a doctor are not allowed to use calculator. I will argue saying that you are allowed to use calculator, but do you know how to use it? That's an important question, right? And what calculator can do, you have a clear boundaries, right? So in the same way, if you can understand what is the AI boundaries are, I will argue saying that you are free to use it. Right? But if you don't know the boundaries of AI, and then you are trying to use it, this is like me expecting calculator to come up with AI model given input output data, right? So in some sense, you need to know the boundaries of the AI. There is nothing wrong in using AI as long as you know what the AI can do. Right? So this is
I
my
think calculator is a very good example because many people fear that use of calculators will make us bad at maths. Many people fear that use of smartphones will make us bad in terms of remembering things. Yes, to some degree, we become worse at some things that we used to do well earlier. But by and large, maths does not become weaker because of calculators, and the world does not stop functioning. A general principle, of course, is that people using AI for a given task should ask themselves, can I do this task without the AI? That's probably one of the ways you know for certain that you are a safe user of AI, that you can estimate the output.
nicely
I
put.
think we're coming pretty much at the end of the hour. This was a lovely talk, and I think I'll go back to Suresh for anything final that he has to add.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anurag and Dr. Phaneendra. It was a wonderful lecture, first of all, a lot of appreciation all over. And I'm sure, Dr. Anurag, we can't cover all the questions because there are more than 180 relevant questions and close to 200 other questions which are partly relevant to our topic. We can't take all those things, but few common things that people have given as a feedback today for both of you and for us also at the NBMS is that Is there any way how these people can reach out to you if they have a specific question? Can we make your mail IDs or any of them available if they are interested to do so? Probably I leave the question to you people to answer at the end of it. And they told that the legal and other aspects have been really very well covered by Dr. Anurag. I don't think I can add anything other than few specific interests which are coming in hundreds to learn more about this specific class. And unstructured data is one question, Dr. Anurag. I think we can touch upon that. The gentleman has asked.
Yes, I mean,
Professor Anurag, you want to
please.
take it up?
Hey, friend, you can go ahead and
Yeah.
answer about the
So,
unstructured data, how to use it.
I will argue saying that if the data is coming from the provider, which is like mostly the clinics, I will argue saying that most of it will be in semi-structured format. You have a patient ID and corresponding to it, you have the data. But where is the difficulty that lies is that if a particular individual is collecting its own data, like let's assume like CGM type of data, which is coming to your mobile phones into the apps, they tend to be unstructured. And remember that if it is an unstructured format, you also want to be a little bit cognizant to that fact that it may not have the quality as you deserve, because a lot of it is coming from an uncontrolled environment. Right? So this uncontrolled environment adds a little bit of uncertainty towards the data. So that's the part I wanted to mention, that unstructured data, you also want to have good quality metrics for you to convert into structure.
Right. And in our experience, and particularly you're right, when I'm going to re-emphasize that, any work you do with patient data should be with downloaded models as opposed to feeding it into online models. Otherwise, it's a violation. But assuming you have access to facilities where you can download the models and run them, if you take semi-structured data and you have your own high-quality annotators, and you provide examples of conversions of semi-structured to structured, then after a few short learning, it is possible to further, train even your tune. Some of the downloadable models to do that job for you, but it's a continuous learning process in something as simple as extracting drug names and labels. After scraping the entire Tata 1mg databases, we found almost 15-20% hallucinations using accepted models. After a few short training, it went down to 2 to 3%, but we could never get rid of that last 2-3%. And you have to be just careful in these things. So I think that's probably, and this is a huge challenge for everyone. And it's a great area of ongoing work.
Thank you very much, everyone. That is indeed a very, very great lecture. Just, one from our side, NBMS, there was some quality issue in the audio. We apologize for that. The next video, we are going to just fix that as well. But it was a wonderful having both of you here, sir. And from all the participants, we thank both the speaker and moderator for sparing the valuable time. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Pleasure to be here. Bye.
Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Suresh sir, for coordinating session. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.